Morning to you all. Glad to be back here once again. As Michael mentioned, we'll be finishing our series Christ or Chaos now, and with this sermon part 6, and we'll be examining the text that we looked at earlier, Psalm 33. We won't be examining every single portion of it in fine detail. There are portions which will kind of flow into other parts of the psalm in a more exegetical nature. Many of you have noticed, by the way, that we have another of God's creatures with us this morning. He's a beautiful rescue dog, and so having him here is actually quieter than most babies sometimes. So we're glad to have all of God's creatures present and hearing his word this morning. So Psalm 33. What we'll be doing is I'll read to you from the opening verses so that we then get kind of context that flows forward into what we'll actually be exegeting and examining in detail. For those who are familiar with this psalm, it is one of naturally the more familiar psalms in the corpus. It is also one that has quite weighty theology. It discusses fairly significant theological matters, and there's a variety of things that could be addressed from a psalm like this, which is of kind of average length, but nevertheless contains very much meat and potatoes from a theological perspective. What we'll be particularly doing is highlighting more of the kind of broad, overarching nature of the purpose of this psalm. There are those who have referred to this psalm as an ode to the divine sovereign. In other words, an ode to the sovereign God. The sovereignty of God as a theological subject, as a theological notion, is prevalent not just throughout the psalm, but it indeed is the foundation thereof. And so that in particular is what we'll be focusing on. You'll also see kind of naturally as we progress through the text a number of kind of overlapping concepts to what we've actually been looking at throughout this series. You'll see the way in which it references the creation. You'll see the way in which it references the sovereignty of God over things like reality and truth, and this concept of order that we've discussed kind of in and throughout our series. And so keep that in mind as you're reading. Those kind of connections will be highlighted in as much as they can be. But this psalm will be one in which we will find great exhortation, not just broadly, but also personally on an individual level as well. So let me just begin from verse 1. It gives us the framing, it gives us the foundation and a background from which we'll then be able to go on and continue to exegete. So verse 1 of Psalm 33. Shout for joy in Yahweh, O you righteous. Praise befits the upright. Give thanks to Yahweh with the lyre. Make melody to him with the harp of 10 strings. Sing to him a new song. Play skillfully on the strings with loud shouts. This is typical Hebraic form of a call to worship. It's a concept and certainly an introduction that features throughout many of the Psalms. The Psalms by nature, for those who are unaware, are hymns. They are songs. These would have been sung by God's ancient people. They are the corpus of music that was sung. It's fascinating to consider that fact, by the way, given the fact that not all the Psalms are the same. They're ordered thematically, but nevertheless we find that there are a variety of different subjects that are covered throughout the Psalms, including psalms that are referred to as imprecatory psalms. Psalms which feature little to no hope. They are rather dark in nature, and they are an outpouring of grief. They are an outpouring of distress and of anger and of rage at times. They are a way in which God connects with his people, and here we are being given a very standard introduction to what then comes after. The Psalms, by their nature, don't just tell, hey, praise Yahweh, and give you no reason as to why. The purpose of the Psalms are actually to exclaim and to proclaim forth the reasons as to why Yahweh should be worshipped, who he is in his character and attributes, what he has done in his world as a result of those characteristics and those attributes. And so here we're being called to praise this Yahweh, this Lord, and here is why we should do so. From verse 4, for the word of Yahweh is upright, and all his work is done in faithfulness. He loves righteousness and justice. The earth is full of the steadfast love of Yahweh, the chesed. It's a phrase that we've examined plenty of times throughout our teaching, our preaching. The steadfast love. There's a variety of English adjectives you could probably apply there. The steadfast love, the faithful love, the eternal love, the loyal love, on a bit more of a symbolic level, the covenantal love of God. The love that is exercised through his covenant with his people. Does that make sense? That's why the concept of faithfulness or eternality or loyalty is endemic to that word, chesed. The faithful or steadfast love. The love that endures by the mere virtue of God's own character. Because he is immutable, he is, in other words, unchangeable. He is not man that he should lie, as we are told in other parts of the scriptures. When he says, so it is. What he has proclaimed forth most assuredly is and does come to be. Does that make sense? It is based on who he is. It's based on his character. That's why those terms about him loving righteousness and justice, right? All his works being done in faithfulness. These are also things which he defines. Very much like our series Lex Rex earlier in the year, right? The law is king. We examined that who is it that defines and is the arbiter and judge of the law? God. He is the one who defines morality in his being. Everything that is good and evil comes forward from him. These things like justice and righteousness, these are also defined by him. These are also part of that ordering that he has done in his creation, as we examined particularly in the first and second week. It means, just as a very brief aside, that throwing adjectives onto words like justice, say perhaps social justice, racial justice, economic justice, or any other form of adjective which you want to tack onto the front of it, is by definition a step away from genuine justice. Justice in and of itself doesn't need an adjective in front of it. Things are either just or unjust. There are no multiple characteristics, multiple categories by which we are somehow meant to evaluate something like justice. I only mention that because the word justice is so prevalent in our kind of common social conscience in society today. These very characteristics and terms are also defined by this God, whose earth is filled with his steadfast love. The psalmist doesn't stop there, however. He then moves in to some of the more weighty or the more direct reasons as to why this God is to be worshipped, why indeed he is sovereign. Let us continue on verse 6. By the word of Yahweh the heavens were made, and by the breath of his mouth all their hosts. He gathers the waters of the sea as a heap. He puts the deep into storehouses. Here the psalmist is referencing the creation itself. We examined this in week 1 for those who recall. We examined those first 2 verses, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. This definitive statement that all that is and all that has come to be has indeed come from this one divine source. He is the God who ordered that primordial chaos, that void and that formlessness that we looked at, and brought from chaos order, structured after him. Pointing here to that creation is a vital component of us understanding what on earth this psalmist is actually proclaiming forth. That fundamental component of the reality of the one true and sovereign God creating the world in his order is vital to us understanding anything else that flows forward. That was, broadly speaking, the point that we looked at in that first week of this series. And so here the psalmist, knowing that, is pointing to that very fact. This is the God that has not come forth from the creation as those around the nation of Israel believed. These are not the gods who came forward from primordial chaos, like the Babylonians believed, like the Egyptians believed, the Assyrians, the Sumerians, the Akkadians, the Persians, and so on. This is the God over whom all things are reigned. Over all things are found in their subsistence. This is that God from which all things have come, and therefore from which all goodness, all righteousness, all justice, which was referenced, come forward as well. We must not lose that component or that reality that this God is indeed above all and is seated above all, that he is enthroned, as the psalmist goes on to say, above all. That provides a pretext, and this, what we've read thus far, is the pretext for why the psalmist is able to continue on in the way that he is in reference to God enthroned, having his eye upon not just his people, but also the inhabitants of the earth. Okay? The concept of that sovereignty sets the pretext and sets the foundation for both the good and the proverbial bad things that are then said in the following text. For the exhortations and the warning specifically that are given. A warning, and even an exhortation as well, but a warning at least, isn't very potent if there isn't an element of authority and sovereignty. Okay? Me making a threat to arrest you for a crime does little to nothing because I'm not vested with that kind of deputized authority. Likewise, me coming and saying that you owe me tax money also has little efficacy because you don't owe me tax because I'm not vested with that sovereignty or authority. Pithy examples, but when you scale this up, this is what we're talking about. Having established that God is indeed the creator, he is indeed the divine sovereign behind the very creation itself, the psalmist continues on from verse 8. As a response in almost to the first 7 verses, verse 8 says, "Let all the earth fear Yahweh. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him. For he spoke and it came to be. He commanded and it stood firm." This is where we start to then get into the real kind of earthy nature of this sovereignty. There is the call, the imperative, that all the earth should fear Yahweh. An interesting thing about the word fear in Hebrew is that it means, well, fear. There's actually nothing very special about it. Fear means just that. We cannot kind of water it down simply to meaning a matter of respect or of submission, although those components are very much inherent to the word. Fear does indeed mean fear. There is a level of fear that a power of that nature should inspire in anyone with a functioning brain. Anyone who understands the power with which they are dealing with should feel an element of fear. I can guarantee that if an 800-pound grizzly bear were to walk in here, you would very much feel fear. But we have seen, and we've actually seen incidentally throughout a couple of the sermons, that this is the God who, when Job questions him, when Job has doubts, he points to a creature called Leviathan. He points to a creature so gigantic, so terrifying, so dominant, so awe-inspiring, that he says there is no creature greater than this. This is the greatest of my monsters. And he points to him and says, "See this, which causes you to be struck down in fear? I created that." To paraphrase it in somewhat of a fashion, to point it out, this is my pet. This is the creature that I made, and it is nothing compared to I. This is the power with whom we deal with. This is the one who spoke and it came to be. Not he applied lots of force and it didn't work out initially, but he then tried some new tricks and things and managed to kind of tack along. No. He spoke and it came to be. That's terrifying. In a good way, right? That's terrifying. He spoke and said, "Let there be the sun," and there's the sun. This object 93 million miles away, which sits there, which so far and seems so normal to us, but yet is so much more massive than the earth, and which would incinerate us upon even getting within a ballpark of its proximity. He created that. He created the vastness of the universe in which we live. He created every single galaxy, every single star, every single planet without breaking a sweat. We also get this kind of reference throughout other Psalms as well, to the Messiah and the way in which his kingdom will be built, the way in which he has gone forth and established his kingdom and then rules in the midst of his enemies, these kinds of phrases which are familiar to us. And this Messiah is described as achieving that justice and achieving that kingdom without breaking a reed, without breaking a sweat, without panting like a deer. It's using imagery to describe the absolute ease with which this Messiah achieves it. The salvation of his people on a macroscopic level is achieved without breaking a sweat. He does not fret nor worry over what the peoples of the earth are doing, about what different powers are doing to try and thwart him. He does it without breaking a sweat. This is the exact kind of concept when he says, he commanded and it stood firm. The sovereignty that's being explained to us here describes to us why this Yahweh should be worshipped, why he should be feared. We'll move through to verse 10. Yahweh brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He frustrates the plans of the peoples. The counsel of Yahweh stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. This is classic Hebrew parallelism, which we see often when we examine the Old Testament broadly, but especially the Psalms. He brings the counsel of the nations to nothing, right? He frustrates their plans, instantly paralleled with what? The counsel of the Lord stands forever. It's almost like you could almost put the kind of conjunction, but the counsel of the Lord stands forever, right? His plans to all generations, they stand forever. Man plans, God laughs. Man plans and has all these great machinations to use all the resources at our disposal to come up with great plans and great desires and great structures and great institutions to achieve, not always, but often, our own selfish, greedy desires. But here, the psalmist is saying those plans God brings to nothing. And he does it in the same kind of way as what was just referenced, right? He does it with the same kind of ease as what was just referenced in the world, the creation coming to be simply because he spoke it. And it's paralleled with the reality that indeed his plans to all generations, right, all of them, there's a plenary sense in the scope of this, they do stand. Let's flip over just for a good cross-reference to what exactly this is addressing. Flip over with me to Psalm 2. Psalm 2. Psalm 2, apart from the fact that it's obviously thematically addressing the same things, Psalm 2 is a psalm of David, we're told in the New Testament. It's not referenced in the title here, but we're told, I believe in Acts 4 off memory, that this was a psalm of David. Psalm 33 is not a psalm of David. So we're not just getting one voice, we're actually getting multiple voices through different psalmists. We're not going to exegete this deeply, but I'm going to use it as a cross-reference. Just begin in verse 1 of Psalm 2. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves and the rulers take counsel together against Yahweh and against his anointed, his Messiah, saying, let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us. Right? The nation, this term casting or bursting away of bonds is a kind of symbolism of rebellion. Right? Fits in exactly what was said in verse 1. Right? The nation's raging and the people's plotting in vain. Why do they do it? Why? Especially when you consider what verse 4 says. Because he who sits in the heavens laughs. Yahweh holds them in derision. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury, saying, as for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. Familiar yet again to the psalm that we reference all the time, the most commonly referenced psalm in the New Testament, Psalm 110. Yahweh says to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make all your enemies a footstool for your feet. Right? Bring them into submission and make them bow down before you. Yahweh, the Lord, sends forth from Zion, this holy hill which was referenced, your mighty scepter, saying, rule in the midst of your enemies. This is what he is speaking of. This is whom he is speaking of. This is this divine Messiah, this king, this anointed one, who rules from Zion, whose scepter, whose power, whose authority has gone forth, and who rules in the midst of his enemies. That's why this Yahweh laughs. Verse 7 says, I will tell of the decree. The Lord said to me, you're my son. Today I have begotten you. Not in the physical sense, but today I've begotten you, used symbolically as put you into a status of authority, put you and given you a status as a firstborn. Ask of me and I will make the nations your heritage and the ends of the earth your possession. You shall break them. You could also say you could rule them with a rod of iron and dash them into pieces like a potter's vessel, like a piece of clay. This is pointing to that sovereignty yet again, the same kind of concepts that we're seeing from Psalm 33. And what's the imperative? What's the invocation here? Now therefore, O kings of the earth, be wise. Be warned, O rulers of the earth. Serve Yahweh with fear. The same concepts we're getting. Kiss the Son, bow down, kiss the ring, proverbially speaking, lest he be angry and you perish in his path. For his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are all who take refuge in him. This is one of the marquee psalms on this kind of subject that's being referenced from Psalm 33. He looks upon the nations who plot against him, who make all kinds of plans in rebellion. But what does the psalmist say as a parallel against that? His plans stand forever because he is true and because he is sovereign. His word is true, therefore his actions are likewise true, and his counsel stands forever. It goes forward to all the generations. Right? This kind of speaking of a plenary sense, similar to the way in which we see to the 1000th generation. It's not saying in a literal sense that kind of when you get to generation 1001, the whole thing falls apart. It's speaking about time. It's speaking about gravity. To the 1000th generation, as far as one can imagine, as far as one can see. This is this sovereign God. This is why Psalm 12, which will be familiar to many, from Psalm 33 verse 12 says, blessed is the nation whose God is Yahweh, the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. The first kind of clause of that verse is familiar. It's used quite heavily in an American context, but it's used heavily in a Western context and has been for centuries. Here, obviously, contextually, in the time period in which this is being written, this is specifically referencing the kingdom of Israel. This is specifically referencing Old Testament Israel, okay, contextually. That's why he finishes by saying the people whom he has chosen as his heritage, right? The heritage which was referenced in Psalm 2 that we just read, right? This inheritance, this Messiah, well, inherits. Here, however, we understand this when we move into a new covenant context as the people of God, right? We are the people whom he has chosen as his heritage. This was the fundamental shift between the Old and New Covenant. Old Covenant in that day was found amongst the Hebrews, among the Israelites, and they were surrounded by pagan nations in darkness. One of the seminal foundational shifts between the Old and New Covenant was the opening up, the expansion, if you will, of the nature, kind of the definition of God's people. Right? That in itself is an entire subject. You'd want to be referencing places like Romans chapters 9 through 11 and a variety of other texts. Right? But this concept, there is neither Jew nor Greek. There is an opening up of the people of God from just specifically the nation of Israel, right, the ethnic people of Israel, to the world, to the Gentiles. And the gospel goes forth from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and to the ends of the earth, like we looked at in the Bible study. So here, wherever God's people are found, like us here, we are blessed as his heritage. And nations where his people are found, especially en masse from a historical perspective, likewise shall they be blessed, so long as what? God, Yahweh, is their God. The Lord, Yahweh, is the one who they worship, is the one who they fear, is the one who they revere, is the one who they bow down and submit to. Not perfectly, not in absolute totality, obviously, but as a pattern, as an established socio-cultural premise, as a foundation of culture, kind of like we looked at last week. Where does their worship lie? To whom is their worship oriented? Such nation shall be blessed, and blessed specifically through his people. Blessed specifically by the nation, the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom of his people. It's a terrifying thing when such people abandon Yahweh as their God. That is what we looked at last week. When the worship shifts, when the worship changes orientation and direction, so too shall the culture. If a culture shifts its worship toward idols, no matter what form they be in, their culture shall likewise reap such chaos. Why? Because of the fact that you are moving out from beneath this sovereignty. You are moving beyond the proverbial borders of this sovereignty. You are moving outside, or trying to move outside, I should rather say, of the borders of this rule, of this reign, of this God. That's what you're attempting to do when you shift your worship into idolatry, when you shift your allegiance. You're trying to abandon and rebel against Christ, right? The same Christ from Psalm 2, who the nations rage against. And when you do that, you abandon order. You abandon righteousness. You abandon justice. And what is left? Chaos. Chaos is what is left. Fortunately for us, we see from verse 13 onward that Yahweh looks down from heaven. He sees all the children of man. From where he sits enthroned, he looks out upon all the inhabitants of the earth. He who fashions the hearts of them all and observes all their deeds. Again, even the hearts of man are fashioned by this God. He is the potter and we are the clay, is the analogy that is given so often throughout the Old Testament and as well as throughout the New, particularly by Paul, most famously in chapter 9 of the book of Romans. He is sovereign even over the hearts of mankind, and he observes all of our deeds. That's why this psalmist says in verse 16 that the king is not saved by his great army. A warrior is not delivered by his great strength. The war horse is a false hope for salvation, and by its great might it cannot rescue. The things that man looks to for this proverbial rescue, for this refuge, for this salvation, are fruitless, are baseless, are foundationless if they are found outside of God. It's not even saying here, by the way, as an interesting kind of lexical point to draw out, that the warrior doesn't have might, the warrior doesn't have strength, that the king doesn't have a great army, It's also not saying that the war horse can't bring salvation in terms of like rescuing from peril. What it's saying is that the king is not saved by that great army. Do you understand the kind of semantic difference it's making? All right? It's not saying that these things don't exist or that they aren't things that are around us, that aren't real. What it's saying here is that these, ultimately, armies, might of the warrior, right, the skill sets, right, the war horse, right, these proverbial things which are obviously endemic to conflict and to war, those objects, those means, those mechanisms cannot save you. They cannot ultimately be a source of true hope for rescue and for salvation. Your prolific education system, your mighty courts, your intricate, complicated political system, your great economic might and wealth, your armies and your militaries, which make Rome look like a bunch of kids playing toy soldier in the sandpit, none of that can save us. Us as a nation thinking of ourselves to be righteous and just and good and having genuine hope because of any of these things is the definition of foolishness. From an ultimate perspective, from a broad metaphysical perspective, our economic might means nothing. Our military prowess means nothing. All of our education principles, our institutions, all of our laws and our human rights and all these other things, which in and of themselves, many of them are actually genuinely good things, none of that provides salvation. None of that, in the face of the divine judge, can do anything for us. None of it. Because here he says that you are not saved by these things. These will not bring you true rescue. These will not grant you glory. These will not grant you righteousness upon particularly the day of judgment. These great and mighty things of man are no hope for salvation. They are no hope whatsoever. I'm going to reference for you something from Psalm 146. I'll read from it fairly quickly. You can feel free to turn there if you would like, but Psalm 146. From verse 1, it begins the same way. Praise Yahweh, O my soul. I will praise Yahweh as long as I live. I will sing praises to my God while I have my being. The same kind of beginning. Put not your trust in princes, in the sons of men, in whom there is no salvation. When his breath departs, these princes, when his breath departs, he returns to the earth. On that very day, his plans perish. None of it brings you salvation. I remember reading an article once, I forget exactly when it was written. It was when one of the Rockefellers died. The Rockefellers are a kind of legacy dynasty in America and in Europe. Great magnates and business family. Hundreds of billions of dollars probably across the family. Things like oil and various other enterprises as such. I believe it was David Rockefeller, don't quote me, but it was one of the Rockefellers. And anyway, his executor of state when he passed away was being interviewed about what specifically had been left in the will, right? What had been subdivided unto the children and what things were going to various places. And the question was asked, what did Mr. Rockefeller leave behind? The executor, in a very laconic fashion, said one word: everything. Right? Everything. He left everything behind. He left every home, every car, every business, everything. He left this world with exactly what he came into it with. And in fact, actually left it with less, because at least he came into the world with breath. From the dust you were made, and to the dust you shall return. Put not your hope in princes, put not your hope in mighty men, put not your hope in this institution, in this politician, in this charismatic man, in any other means or machination that you can possibly imagine. Put not your hope in these things, or these people, for in them is no salvation. When they die, their plans depart. But rather, from verse 5, blessed is he whose help is the God of Jacob. That's what it's talking about. That's what the psalmist back in Psalm 33 continues by saying. Because in juxtaposition to that, the psalmist in Psalm 33 continues in verse 18, and he says this to us. Behold, the eye of Yahweh is upon those who fear him, on those who hope in his chesed, his steadfast love. That same term we saw back up at the top of this psalm. It's upon those who fear him. It's now the second reference to fear. It's upon those whose allegiance is pledged unto this God, who fear him, who understand him, who know him, who have bent the knee in submission to this God, to his sovereign power, to his divine authority. His eye is upon them. This kind of symbolically referencing his overwatching, thinking almost like a mother bird who watches over her young, or a shepherd who watches over his flock. It's a symbolism of care, of provision, of direction, of protection, of guidance, of refuge. His eye is upon those who fear him, those who hope not in the things that were just mentioned, the great king, the mighty warrior, the powerful warhorse, but rather upon those whose hope lies where? In his loyal, in his faithful covenantal love. It's the only thing that can provide hope. This covenantal love, this steadfast or loyal love. Why? In order, from verse 19, that he may deliver their soul from death and keep them alive in famine. Death and famine here again are being paralleled in this very Hebrew form. He will deliver their soul from death. He will keep them alive in famine. Obviously, the very kind of on the surface reading of that is a literal one, right? Delivering them from death, right? Keeping them alive in famine. These were things which at many different points the people of Israel knew, right? Whilst this is not a psalm of David, this is something which David knew intimately, being delivered from immediate physical, right, temporal death. Right? But famine being paralleled with death is fascinating here. Because obviously death, well, is death, right? But famine, being without, resources having dried up, not being fed, not being taken care of. This is famine. Famine is something which is so dramatically removed from our context, it's sometimes difficult to imagine. Right? Famine is, I would argue, quite often a fate worse than immediate death. Of all the great calamities that can befall a people, famine, I might argue, is the worst. As horrific as war is, right, as being caught in a war zone of the bombardments, of the tanks, the bombs, the bullets, as bad as that is, there is an element in which you can rally together. There's an element in which you can find some refuge, an element in which you can kind of band together, right? People found in a common struggle kind of idea. Does that make sense? Yep. There's that element, difficult, horrific, but there's still that element that's possible, right? Natural disasters, as horrific as flooding, as tsunamis, tornadoes, so on can be, earthquakes, right? Name anything, bushfires. There's an element in which people can rally together in that same kind of sentiment. That doesn't happen in famines. That doesn't happen. Not en masse, right? On the whole. Famine, when it befalls a people, is the time in which a mother will eat her young. people will murder, will abandon all hope of common cause, and are driven to a point of pure animalistic survival. I was reminded when I read this of an example that comes from the first century, from Josephus, the renowned Jewish historian in the first century. Wrote a number of kind of secondary source references to Jesus. He was intimately present with the fall of Jerusalem, which ultimately occurred in 70 AD. The Romans had besieged Jerusalem, surrounded it. They had forced it into starvation, unfortunately by the actions actually of the own people of Jerusalem, who, without giving the entire history, actually burnt a lot of their food sources. But they had descended into full-blown famine. And by the time the Romans had breached the city walls and were now moving throughout the city to conquer it, Josephus gives us this story. It's not a long one, but it's a story in which a Roman legion is moving, part of the Roman legion is moving through the streets of Jerusalem, right? Clearing buildings, looking for enemy combatants. They come upon just a foul stench, right? The kind of stench that kind of almost punches you in the face, that hits you and it's like, oh, crikey, what is that? They naturally go to find the source of it. Right? And they come upon a woman who Josephus refers to simply as Miriam, right? Just the Hebrew name, right, for Mary, right? A very common name in those days. She's sitting there just with a little fire, right? And she's eating some food. She's cooking some meat over some fire. But in this very nonchalant fashion, just sitting there, just kind of almost dazed out of it, just sitting there as if the world around her hasn't descended into chaos, sitting there. And these legionnaires are trying to find the source of this, and this Miriam, we're told, then offers the legionnaires a piece of food, and they start to eat, and they eat until they kind of look behind and see the chopped up body of a young girl, because as we're told by Josephus, this Miriam had killed her own daughter, chopped her into pieces, and was now eating her. We're also told from that siege, this chaos which descended upon Jerusalem, that people were reduced to scouring the sewers in order to eat feces as an only source of nutrition. This is what famine does. That's chaos. That's chaos. That's what happens ultimately in terms of this symbolic sense when you abandon this God. These are the things far down the track that befall people when they have abandoned order, when they abandon reason, when they abandon truth, when they abandon the sovereignty of this God who we've been reading of. But fortunately for us, when all these things have descended into chaos, even to the point of things as bad as famine, this God, we're told, is able to do what? Deliver our soul from death and to keep us alive in famine. He is able to rescue us from these things, either literally, here in the temporal sense, or ultimately in the sense of salvation. He is sovereign, and his will and power is greater than even these things which befall peoples when they abandon God and descend into chaos. The psalmist so beautifully finishes by saying, our soul waits upon Yahweh. He is our help and our shield. He is the one who protects us. He is the El Gibor, the great mighty warrior who goes forth and fights for us and who defends us and who protects us and brings us the victory, brings us the salvation. Our heart is glad in him, not in the kings, not in the warriors, not in the war horses, not in the education system, not in the justice system, not in the politics. Our hope is in him. Our heart is glad in him because we trust not in those things, but in his holy name. We trust in his name. Then the invocation to finish. Let your chesed, again, your steadfast, loyal, covenantal love, O Yahweh, be upon us, just as we hope in you. When things around us shift and orient themselves toward chaos, we not only can, but indeed must fix our hope not in temporal means and mechanisms, but ultimately in God. It does not mean that there are not physical, temporal things to do in this world. There very much is. But our hope does not lie ultimately in those things. It does not lie in our own abilities to achieve those things. Our hope can and indeed only must reside where? God. In His sovereignty, in His divine status, in His ultimate authority, kingship, power. Not just for the things that go on around us, but indeed for our own salvation. When we come to the table in just a moment to partake of the elements, we do not simply do that as a means of demonstrating our faith. This is a demonstration of His faith. This is a demonstration of what He has done. When we baptize people, it is not a symbol of our faith. It is not even necessarily inherently a proclamation of our faith. It's a symbol and a proclamation of what He has done. Our salvation lie not in our ability, in our powers, in our things, in our mechanisms, in our institutions. If it does not rely in God, there is no hope. But we are told here that this God is sovereign, that this Christ is the one true King who has inherited all power and authority. And He shall reign in the midst of His enemies. And His scepter shall go forth from Zion, and He will rule until all enemies have been brought into submission. The last of which we're told by Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 is death itself. This Christ, this mighty fortress who is our God, He is reigning, He is ruling, and He is going forth and conquering. And our hope, rightly, can and indeed must be in Him.